On today's Prophecy in the News, we're going to continue a study that we've been on for several weeks now. It seems fascinating to me that the more we study the Hebrew alphabet, the more we learn things that we've never seen before and cannot find in anybody's commentaries. And when we got into a study of the book of Genesis, we noted that Genesis had an alphabetic design. In fact, the first 22 chapters of Genesis cover the themes found in the meanings of the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. When we come to Genesis 23 and following, we have another alphabet all over again. Genesis 23 is another aleph, Genesis 24 another bet, and so on. Well, as we studied this, it began to dawn on us that these themes found in these chapters of Genesis were actually a topical index of the entire Bible. Now, we had talked about the Old Testament and New Testament from an alphabetic point of view in our book, The Mystery of the Menorah. Now we find that the book of Genesis itself was the first and original outline upon which the framework of the entire Bible was given. Gary Stimman is here to discuss with me this hidden prophecy in Genesis.
And by the way, if you doubt that this is the case, go to Psalm 119 in your Bible, and you will see an alphabetic outline there. The Hebrew alphabet, aleph, bet, gimel, dalet. And when you look at that, you may say, well, what are those Hebrew letters doing there? Well, what they're doing is outlining Psalm 119. Aleph is God. Bet is the blessing and the house, and Gimel is God's loving kindness, and Dalet is the way. And by the way, if you just check the Dalet section of Psalm 119, you'll find the word way repeated over and over and over again. And so we know that this system is at least as old as David, because David wrote using the system.
Now we learn that the system is as old as Genesis, because this incredible book of Genesis gives out actually an outline of the Bible. We have seen in the first 18 chapters of Genesis in the last two programs an overview of the first 18 divisions of the Old Testament. And I must hasten to say that the Old Testament did not always have 39 books. Up until the 3rd century, those 39 books were put together into 22 divisions corresponding with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Well, we come now to Genesis 19, the chapter which corresponds with the 19th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Kof, and we find the story of the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. And lo and behold, when we look at the 19th division of the Old Testament as it was up until the 3rd century, we come to Jeremiah and Lamentations, another destruction of a city.
As a matter of fact, we find Sodom and Gomorrah destroyed in the 19th chapter of Genesis, and we find Jerusalem, spiritual Sodom, shall we say, this is the figure and the type, destroyed in Jeremiah. And there's wailing and lamentations, and of course Jeremiah and Lamentations were originally written as one book, and Lamentations itself is an alphabetic book, but that's another story, as a matter of fact.
Well, you know, the story in Genesis 19, this destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, actually becomes a reference talked about in Jeremiah 23:14, Jeremiah 49:18, Jeremiah chapter 50 verse 40, and in Lamentations chapter 4 verse 6 says, "For the punishment of the iniquity of the daughter of my people is greater than the punishment of the sin of Sodom that was overthrown as in a moment, and no hand stayed on her." So we have these references to Sodom and Gomorrah in Jeremiah and Lamentations, which makes chapter 19 of Genesis literally an overview or a topical index providing the theme for the books of Jeremiah and Lamentations put at that particular point in the Jewish canon. That's incredible. Now let's look at chapter 20 of Genesis. This is the Resh chapter, the story of the wicked. And you remember in Genesis chapter 20 we have the story of a Gentile king trying to take Abraham's wife again. This is the story of wickedness.
Indeed it is, and we have this corresponding story in which Abimelech takes Sarah. And by the way, J.R., this is a spiritual sin in this case. That is, the taking of a man's wife. We now have Abraham and Sarah as the divinely appointed parents. And Abimelech then is placed in the position of actually interfering with God's will. And that's then the theme of this. And he becomes an archetype for the wicked, even, by the way, looking into the far future, perhaps the Antichrist.
Yes. Now we notice this wickedness is prevalent in the book of Ezekiel. Do you remember, for example, God said to Ezekiel, Son of man, I made thee a watchman on the wall. He says, when I say unto the wicked, there's that term wicked, thou shalt surely die, and you don't warn the wicked of his wicked way, to save his life, the same wicked man will die in his iniquity, but his blood I'll require at your hand. And so this word wicked and wickedness appears to be prevalent. As it is in chapter 20 of Genesis, so it is in the book of Ezekiel.
Yeah, and by the way, the book of Ezekiel comes to a smashing climactic end with the battle of Gog and Magog, and God says, I've set myself against you, O Gog. Gog becomes the ultimate expression of wickedness.
And, you know, this Gentile king, Abimelech, takes Sarah. Well, I want you to know that Ezekiel's theme has God's wife being taken into Gentile Babylon as a captive.
Yes.
So we have the same general theme.
We
then we come to Genesis chapter 21 and the Sheen. And I think this is most interesting, Gary, because it says here that Sarah gave birth, in verse 2, she conceived and bare Abram a son in his old age, at the set time. Did you get that? At the set time of which God had spoken to him. So God here has delivered a prophecy of a set time. Isn't that the theme we find in the 21st division of the Old Testament?
It is, and the 21st division of the Old Testament is Daniel. Genesis chapter 21 talks about, and it came to pass at that time, Abimelech and Phicol, the chief captain of the host, spake unto Abraham. And we have at the end of that chapter, Abimelech returning to the land of the Philistines, and Abraham sojourning in the Philistines' land. J.R., the whole of Genesis chapter 21 is kind of prophetic layout or fulfillment, things happening at set times. And in Daniel, the corresponding division, the 21st division of the Old Testament, Daniel is nothing but one set time after another. In appointed times. There's the great statue of Nebuchadnezzar that is the times of the Gentiles. There are the four beasts that lay out the times of the Gentiles. There are the days laid out at the end of Daniel. Everything in Daniel is set times. So here we have perfect correspondence, and as a matter of fact, we could say that Genesis 21 is a kind of a prophetic foreview of certain things that are destined to happen.
Yeah. In fact, the son of promise is born, the birth of Isaac, in chapter 21. And in Daniel, we have the promise of the set time for the birth of the Messiah, the promised son.
Oh, yeah, and we shouldn't, by the way, leave out the fact that this is the letter Sheen. It designates the 21st division, and that's El Shaddai. That's the initial of God, the provider, the one who keeps everything on schedule. And remember in the 7th chapter of Daniel, what a great view we have of the Ancient of Days sitting upon his throne. It's a beautiful picture of El Shaddai.
Yeah. And we have Abraham here, sojourning in the land of the Philistines. Well, in the book of Daniel, we have the Jews sojourning in the land of Babylon. So they're not in their promised land.
That's right.
So this theme of Genesis 21 is remarkable, I think, as we see Sarah becomes a type of grace. The free woman, you remember, becomes Sarah, the free woman. Jerusalem, which is above. Sarah is a type of grace, the free woman, and Jerusalem. Isaac becomes the son of promise. Hagar becomes a type of the law, and Sinai and Ishmael is rejected as heir with Isaac. This is distinctly a prophetic chapter and sets the theme for the prophetic book placed in the canon. I think Daniel fills the spot nicely.
Oh, yes, indeed.
And then we come to this 22nd letter, Tav, which stands for truth and perfection. And we see in chapter 22 what I think is an overview of what became the minor prophets.
In Genesis chapter 22, we have the offering of Isaac by Abraham and the substitution of the ram that was lodged in the thicket. And this is, of course, the model for the crucifixion. Tav being the 22nd letter. And by the way, Tav was originally written as a cross in the old language, the early Hebrew. Tav then is the 22nd division, truth and perfection, also the model for the crucifixion, and would correspond with what was the 22nd book of the Old Testament. In the original layout, the 12 minor prophets were one book, bound together, and simply called the 12.
Yeah.
Now the 12 speak graphically of truth and perfection with Messiah's return. And so we have then this huge prophecy fulfilled.
We have now covered the 22 chapters of Genesis, and we see how they are a topical index for the Old Testament. And Gary Stearman is here to discuss with me this mystery of the topical index. And Gary, the fascinating thing about this is that the Old Testament, which comprises 39 books today, was, up until at least the 3rd century, 22 divisions.
Indeed it was, and several first century writers mention the fact that the Old Testament was in 22 books. And those books were had corresponded originally with the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. So we find this topical arrangement. We find that the letters have meanings, starting with Aleph, God, Creator and King, and ending with the 22nd letter, Tav, truth and perfection. All stops in between are God's plan for the ages, His redemptive plan. So J.R., we've really covered 22 divisions now, Genesis chapters 1 through 22, corresponding to the original Old Testament of 22 chapters. Where do we go from here? Because Genesis has 50 chapters.
Yeah. One thing I want to mention right here before we look at those future chapters is that Moses wrote this book.
Yeah.
Moses did not know that there were going to be 22 books put in the Hebrew canon.
Correct.
He did not know. Maybe let's give him the benefit of the doubt that he knew that the first 5 chapters of Genesis were going to be an overview of his 5 books.
Right.
Okay. He didn't know about chapter 6,
No,
7, 8, 9, 10, and so on. He could not have known that he was literally in. I believe God gave him this verbatim.
Absolutely.
I don't think he could not possibly have put this together. So when God gave Moses these chapters in Genesis, God had a plan in mind. So if we've come through 22 chapters and we have seen the entire Old Testament, what about chapters 23 and following? The next 27 chapters of Genesis, believe it or not, give us a topical index of the 27 books of the New Testament. Gary, that is an eyebrow raiser.
Indeed it is, and I can see that I see a lot of raised eyebrows out there right now, but I want you to know that after a great deal of study, we've discovered that the alphabet recycles. After we cover the first 22 chapters of Genesis, then we come again to a second alphabet, starting with Aleph, but this time moving 27 chapters forward because Hebrew contains 5 final forms. 22 plus 5 equal 27. Exactly the number of chapters in the New Testament. Some coincidence.
Yes. And the amazing thing about the first 22 chapters is that they generally express law.
Yeah.
And the following chapters generally express grace.
Oh, this is true.
Now, a Jewish rabbi would not agree with this because historically the Jews reject the New Testament as a part of the inspired canon of Scripture. But what can we say? I mean, it's here, Gary. It is so plain as the nose on your face, and as we go through these, you're going to see this absolutely incredible view. So let's begin with Aleph, shall we? Or actually, I should say chapter 23, this new Aleph.
And by the way, the new Aleph carries the same meaning as the one we studied in Genesis chapter 1, but it has further amplification because it leads us to the first book of the New Testament, Matthew. Remember, Aleph is the letter that signifies Creator and King. Well, here we have the death of Sarah in Genesis chapter 23. And she was 127 years old, and she died in Kiryat Arba, which is the village of 4, still there today, now called Hebron. And the village of 4 refers to the kingdom, north, south, east, and west. And Hebron, J.R., is another way of expressing the idea of Abraham's bosom. which is paradise, which is heaven.
Yeah. It was there that Abraham bought a subterranean cavern called Machpelah, and there he laid to rest his wife. This became a metaphor for heaven, Abraham's bosom, or paradise. And and by the way, the word Hebron means league or association.
Yes.
And this is associated with heaven, as Hebron is associated with New Jerusalem.
And by the way, the cave of Machpelah, or Sheol, or Abraham's bosom, or paradise, was purchased for 400 shekels of silver. Silver, the metal of redemption. 400 being a multiple of that number we find connected with the kingdom. And by the way, to this very day, J.R., the oldest continuously occupied building, if I'm not mistaken, in the world, is the tomb of the patriarchs, built over the cave of Machpelah. It's a beautiful building, still standing.
Yeah.
Looks like the day it was built, reminding us again of heaven. Now, Genesis 23, Matthew. What's the connection?
Yeah.
What's the connection?
You know, I might mention to you that Abraham stood there one day and God said, look north, look south, look east, look west. This is going to be all yours. But he never owned any of it.
Right.
Except this one spot, Hebron.
Right.
This Abraham owned. He gave 400 shekels of silver for it, and silver then became the metaphor for redemption.
Yes.
And so we can see Sarah being laid to rest in heaven. Now we come to Matthew, and Matthew opens with Christ, the son of Abraham. Voila.
Yes.
We see the fulfillment of the promise of heaven, the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is pictured as a king.
He's pictured as a king.
As seen in Olive?
Oh, absolutely. Matthew is an olive, and that's the creator and king. God is creator and king. In Matthew, Jesus is presented as king. He is proclaimed as king. In the 8th through 11th chapters of Matthew, we have the demonstrations of the power of the king. We have the preparation of the king's disciples. We have the presentation and the rejection of the king. And the king, in the closing chapter of Matthew, offers proof of his kingship.
Yeah.
Because after Christ rose, then he proved to his own that he was king. Now, here's the subject of God as creator and king, and also the word heaven is amazingly portrayed in this book.
Yeah. The word kingdom of heaven is found 32 times in the book of Matthew, nowhere else in the entire New Testament. Only Matthew.
Isn't that amazing?
The kingdom of heaven. So Abraham's kingdom of Hebron, typical of heaven, is beautifully portrayed.
Abraham king.
And Jesus said in Matthew 8:11, many shall come from the east and the west and shall sit down with Abraham in the kingdom. There it is. Matthew then takes the theme given by Genesis chapter 23. Now we come to Genesis chapter 24 and the bait chapter, and to me it is an overview of the Gospel of Mark. Here in Genesis 24 we find the bride for Isaac.
We do. And by the way, bait in the Hebrew is a reflection of the idea of house or temple or tent. Also of blessing. The word bracha or baruch in Hebrew signifies blessing. And also we have the idea expressed here sometimes of duality, or taking one thing and separating it from another. So in Genesis 24 we have Isaac's marriage. Abraham is old. The mantle is passed to Isaac. The land grant, everything is passed down to Isaac, and Isaac moves to a new tent, shall we say, with his new bride.
The interesting thing about it is he takes his bride into his mother's tent. And so this provides the bait, the house, the home, so to speak, and it's connected to where his mother once was. Now, the mystical union between Christ and the church corresponds, I think, with Adam's bride in Genesis 2 and Isaac's bride in Genesis 24 here.
Yes.
And with God's bride in the second book of the Old Testament, Exodus. So here in this second book of the New Testament, we see the bride of Christ portrayed as Jesus comes as a servant. You notice he's pictured as a servant in Matthew? Well, in Genesis 24, Abraham sends his servant to find a bride for Isaac.
Now we have a lot to talk about, and as usual, very little time to complete the idea. But what we have is just a start on the New Testament. 27 books in the New Testament corresponding to the layout found in Genesis chapter 24 and following.
23 through 49.
23 through 49, that's correct. And what we have then is a topical layout of the New Testament, superimposing, shall we say, grace upon Old Testament ideas that we've already discussed.
Yeah. Well, we're into the Abrahamic covenant here. That's the covenant of grace, you see.
It certainly is, yeah.
And the interesting thing about this Gospel of Mark is that the church was founded in Mark's house. In Acts chapter 12, verse 12, when Peter was let out of prison, he went to Mark's house where the people were gathered praying. That's where Jesus had the Last Supper.
Right.
And probably it was the place of the upper room. And the place where they were praying probably on the day of Pentecost. You know, there are 120 people gathered in the house in the upper room. And so we've got a fantastic picture here in this 24th chapter of Genesis as it pictures the Gospel of Mark. And so what we see here is so incredible. It's never been written in anybody's commentary, so don't miss our next program.